Greetings, my dearest friends and comrades. Welcome to another episode of The Carpenter and the Professor. Every time we introduce it, I always flip it. I like putting the carpenter first. Noah likes putting the professor first. But today we're going to have a very special show to discuss someone whose thought and achievements are fundamental for our project and really for every single liberation struggle around the world for the last 100 years. Of course, we're speaking about Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, known to us as Lenin, who on the 21st of this month, a couple of days ago, was the anniversary, the centenary 100th anniversary of his passing. So we'll be talking about the most important developments that Lenin brings to Marxism, how they're relevant for our day, and we'll also cover another story from the labor movement, Sean Fain, who has been giving great speeches concerning how the militant labor movement should be approaching the question of parties and endorsements, whether they should be endorsing any of the candidates who don't actually represent the working class movement that they're leading. So we'll talk about that and much more right after this.
Welcome back, everybody. 100 years since Lenin died. And the world is irrevocably changed.
Yep.
Irrevocably changed since Lenin's lifetime, right? The importance of Lenin, what he stood for, what he did, the theory he created, gets more and more significant as time goes on. In 1917, when the October Revolution takes power, that was the first time in human history that the majority classes were able to seize power from a repressive minority. And the name Lenin is, as lied about as it is here in the U.S., is still seen as a symbol of hope and freedom all over the world. But he's more than just that, right? He is also one of the most brilliant people ever to have lived. The only person of that era that was capable of not only just seeing Marxism and where everyone else had gone wrong and sort of stagnated and abandoned Marxism, but brought Marxism to an entirely new level, right, of development, and synthesized that into the Bolshevik practice. I recently, because it was 100 years since he died, I've been rereading a few letters and the collected works and stuff from the philosophical notebooks. But Carlos recently has been going over Lenin as well and published something in his Substack. I think you guys could all get a lot from. It's the 5 major insights that are not just even insights, but aspects of Lenin that are still pertinent today. By the way, how are you today, Carlos? I feel like I droned on and on there.
No, that was excellent. I'm doing fine. In many ways, we're always reading and rereading Lenin, and just like Marx and Engels and Mao and other figures from our tradition, Du Bois, Winston. These are figures that are central to our reading programs on a weekly basis, even if the research that we're doing changes. And for me, I would add Hegel on there. These figures are pretty consistent. They're cornerstones that we have to be always very close, in close proximity to keep our analysis sharp. It doesn't matter how far away we go in our readings, and how how disconnected from the class struggle some of the readings in philosophy that I might do are. I will always have these figures as centerpieces of what I'm reading, just like reading geopolitical news and all these other different things that are important to keep us grounded. I published the short piece. It's been shared around quite a bit in the internet with some comrades from different projects and magazines and proletarian outlets. One of the things, I put it in the link for anyone interested to read it. I'm not going to keep it up there, but one of the things that I think is most essential from Lenin that is practically ignored, specifically in the West, it's not ignored in the global South, but it is ignored in the West, is the fact that perhaps on the basis of some deeply rooted Eurocentric chauvinism, we tend to think, well, the theory gets developed in the West. Marx and Engels, they're the theorists. And perhaps some of the people who speak like that, they would even say, no, maybe Engels not, just Marx. Those are the theorists. Maybe we can add Luxembourg there because, German. But Lenin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, all these people, all they did was apply. That's all they could do. The West thinks, the East acts. In the West, we have theory. In the East, we have practice. And that's extremely foolish. It's an extremely anti-Marxist position, because part of what makes Marxism so revolutionary in the history of thought as a philosophy, as a Weltanschauung, a worldview, a way of approaching the world, is that it overcomes dialectically this bifurcation between thinking and being, between action and thought. And it sees that in every moment you have these dual aspects of thinking and action. Every action you take is always with a certain degree of consciousness, and every theoretical enterprise you engage in, it's always going to have a certain degree of activity, physicality that's conjoined to it. So when these people have this nice little separation, it's kind of silly. It's amusing to some extent, and it forgets that it is this dialectical interplay of these two aspects of human praxis, of that unity of thinking and being, that really informs the theoretical development of the Marxist worldview. And that's why, in my view, it is figures like Lenin, it is figures like Ho Chi Minh, Mao, Fidel, Che, who have led these struggles, and Marx in his time. We can't downplay, the creation of the First International. I mean, we're 100 and some change years in, and we still don't have a similar international communist and workers organization that is anywhere near that. We had that for a period of time in the 20th century, but it is these thinkers that were able to advance in praxis the class struggle and the struggle for socialism, that were also able to derive some of the most important theoretical advancements to the Marxist tradition. So what I focus on in this article is Lenin as a theoretician, which of course is not disconnected from Lenin, the person that led the Bolshevik Revolution and that constructed for the first few years the Russian socialist state. So, Noah, is it just me, having my head dug into the Western Marxist academics and being critical of them, or do you see some of this division between the thinking and the acting in how the Western Marxists understand Lenin?
I think it's sort of, in my experience with them, it's less directly stated than it used to be, and more implicit in the sort of new woke social chauvinism, right? Where they don't say that, Lenin and Ho Chi Minh, etc., were lesser than. Like the old social chauvinists would just come out and say that they're less developed, whatever. They couch it in a sort of woke language, right? Well, they're all authoritarians, right? That kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's all the same one-sided outlook on things. And I mean, any reading of Lenin that sees him as anything less than one of the most brilliant thinkers in history is a fraudulent reading of Lenin. Especially, and you Carlos mentions this in his paper, the philosophical notebooks, as they're called. When Lenin goes back and decides to reacquaint himself with philosophy and rereads Marx and Engels, everything that he could read by them, rereads Hegel, and he realizes at this point that even a lot of his own thinking had not been fully developed. And he goes off on the sort of mechanistic mistakes that were going on in the so-called Marxists of his era, which I think is interesting because that's exactly what's happening with the so-called Marxists of our era. That's what happens with the purity fetishists. That's what happens with the entire fake left. They call themselves Marxists, but not a single one of them could even, describe, pure being to you, which is where Hegel begins, right? So it's important to sort of push back against that and point out that wokeism is, at the end of the day, always social chauvinism. And Lenin's, just another way to do that in that regard.
Yeah, I agree. There's a statement, interestingly enough, from Lukács, which is from his text, late 1924, in commemoration of Lenin's life. I believe it's late 1924. And he mentioned something that I think most of the Western Marxists who consider Lukács to be the foundation of Western Marxism, we've talked about the reasons for that before. The sixth footnote of the first chapter of History of Class Consciousness, the division of Engels from Marx, the rejection of the dialectics of nature, etc. These are all positions that Lukács backtracks later on. But Lukács mentions that out of the thinkers that the working class movement has produced, the only one that measures up to Marx's stature is Lenin. And I think Engels was brilliant. I think in many ways the brilliance of Marx was very hard to have been actualized without a figure like Engels. It is Engels' encounter with Marx in Paris that sends him to studying political economy, and then specifically British political economy, classical political economy, as is often referred. But Engels himself understood that, in many ways, and in some areas, he was playing the second fiddle. There was other areas where he wasn't. He was taking the lead, like in the study of natural sciences. Engels was very much taking the lead, and Marx was following him. That's really simply because of the fact that there's only so much time that you have in a day, and Marx was planning on writing a history of Western civilization. He was reworking Capital Volume 1 a million fucking times. He had yet to finish Volumes 2 and 3. There was so many things that he was working on. So Engels takes the lead in that field. But for someone to say that Lenin is up there with Marx, it's a statement that I still think it's correct. Lenin, in many ways, is the Marx for the era of imperialism and of the dominance of finance, capital, and monopoly, the monopoly stage of capitalism, and the theoretical insights that come out of the development of the Marxist worldview into this higher stage of capitalism are absolutely central and are in many ways today more pertinent than at the time they were written, because of how intensified things have gotten, how developed those contradictions of imperialism, which he was observing in many ways at its beginning, how intensified those contradictions have gotten. So I developed on 5 points that Lenin adds, I think, to the Marxist tradition. The first one is
Well,
philosophy.
before you go on, Carlos, I want to. I've been reading Marx and Engels for a very long time now. I've always sort of thought of it along the lines that Marx was a very deep philosophical mind, right? That spoke on a deeper level always. And Engels was very, very, very good at editing him. Without a good editor to bring that out and make that language readable for everybody that's not on the Marx level, that stuff passes away. It goes by people. Without Engels doing that work, you don't get Marx as big as he was. And that's not even taking into account the constant conversations and letters, working out that theory together. It's a lot like we work at the Institute, right? Not to say we're, Marx and Engels, but that's the way all of our theory happens. Carlos comes up with a concept and we talk about it for months and we work through every step of it, right? And then we put it down and then we edit it and make sure everybody can get on board and understand the concepts and ideas being, elaborate. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I just needed to get that out.
Yeah, and the point about clarity is so important. We also can't forget Jenny von Westphalen there, Marx's wife, who was in her own right pretty brilliant, and one of the few people, maybe a handful of people, who could understand Marx's handwriting and make it coherent. And she was, of course, very well educated, so she helped Marx very much with presenting his ideas in a way in which it was understandable. So it's a dual aid there from Engels and Jenny. Yeah, I think the first point that I develop, in my view, that Lenin brings Marxism forward in, is philosophy.
Mhm.
And I've after writing mine, I've read almost all of the ones that have been published in various Marxist and Communist party-related websites. None of them talk about philosophy. None of them. And it's extremely sad because Marxism is it's a philosophy. It is because it's a philosophy that it is capable of developing, on the basis of political economy, studies of political economy, a critique of capitalism, a comprehensive understanding of capitalism. It is because it's a philosophy that it is able to develop and give us insights into the class struggle, into historiography. So it's a philosophy first before everything. And I was very disillusioned to see that no one else had really pointed at the way in which Lenin develops upon the explicit writings in philosophy within the Marxist tradition. Marx and Engels are not writing about philosophy much. Marx had, in a couple letters, in a letter to Joseph Dietzken, German-American philosopher, Marx and Engels often called him the other individual who developed dialectical materialism alongside with them. Marx told in a letter to Dietzken that he wanted to write a book called Dialectics, right, where he would provide a summary of the rational kernel of Hegel's worldview and how it gets incorporated into Marxism. Basically, what is that which we take from Hegel and what is it that we leave behind? What's the rational kernel and the mystical shell that we leave behind? He also promised something very similar to someone else in a letter. And He never did it. It was the first thing that Engels went to look for. Engels didn't go look for the manuscripts for Capital Volume 2 or Volume 3. The first thing he went to look for, and this is written in a letter to a Russian sociologist, is the dialectics text that Marx was supposed to write. So the philosophy. He never wrote it, which is very unfortunate. Engels did develop something akin to it in parts of Dialectics of Nature, but it's an unfinished, unrefined pamphlet, which is extremely valuable, but I don't think it does the job of what the dialectics text that Marx promised would have. But Lenin's, in many ways, does. There's, after his reading in 1914, he's in Switzerland, the start of the First World War, and he's reading the history of philosophy. He's going through Hegel primarily, but he's also going through Aristotle. He's going through some of the classics of Marxism. He's going through Feuerbach, right, the philosophical foundations of Marxism, which is not a coincidence why he tells us at the beginning of the revolution, in a speech to the young communists, you need to drink and bring into your outlooks the best of the thought that humanity has produced. If all you know is Marxism, forget about it. You're lost. If all you know is sloganeering, you're lost. You need to drink in the best insights of humanity, the traditions of philosophy, the most developed parts of the sciences. So he's doing this in 1914, and he produces many interesting, almost like summations, equivalents to Marx's dialectics, which have been very important for teaching the dialectical materialist outlook for students. Conjoint with that, you have his annotations in his readings of Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, basically a text where Hegel summarizes the central aspects of his worldview, whether it's the political philosophy, the phenomenology of spirit, and the logic and the philosophy of nature within those three central parts, and the philosophy of history as well. Lenin also reads Hegel's text on the philosophy of history. He reads Hegel's Science of Logic, which is a monstrous text. When I read the Science of Logic, first I read it with my volume 38, with Lenin right there next to me, reading Hegel with Lenin. So these annotations are pure gold for Marx's philosophy, and in many ways, the absence of Marx's dialectics text gets filled up by Lenin. And that is one of the most valuable things that he provides for us, and it's not mentioned. And in conjunction to that, and I'll just say this real quick because I want to toss it over to you. In conjunction to that, you have a text that has been denigrated by the Western Marxists as a promotion of a quote-unquote vulgar materialism, right? Which is the 1908, 1909 Materialism and Imperial Criticism, a critique of the neo-Kantian idealist influences that were seeping through into Russian Marxists. Many times the people that were politically aligning themselves with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And in this text, he defends Marxist materialism. He defends the role that it has as the most advanced materialism for the developments of the sciences. He critiques these newly reformed forms of old idealism that appear and just end up taking new forms, but are already well beyond being defeated. You have the famous Sartre quote: "Every new philosophy is a rehashing of something that Marx had already defeated." In many ways, Lenin reminds us of that at the turn of the century, and he defends something that is not very popular even to this day: a philosophical realism, the defense of an extra mental reality, which I think is one of the foundational principles for materialism. They take his emphasis on the materialism part of dialectical materialism to mean that it's just that he's leaving out the dialectics and that it's this vulgar mechanistic materialism. And it's completely absurd. And so they give you a division. They say, well, the Lenin after 1914 is amazing. The one before that is just, he's just basically Plekhanov and repeating Plekhanov's ideas, vulgar Marxism, etc. It's absurd. When you read it as a dialectician, you see that it's a continuation of the development of Marxist philosophy. And then you have to read them in conjunction. You can't read them in disjunction. But the logic of disconnection instead of interconnection that you have with the Western Marxists divides everything. You have the division of Engels from Marx. You have the division of Lenin before and after 1914, the division of Soviet leadership before and after Lenin, the division of Marx when he's young and when he's old. You have all these divisions that are just foisted onto reality. But I'll pass it over, brother.
I love the word foist.
Yeah, it's
Just shoving this extra things that don't belong onto reality, right? That's what they're doing. And what I really want to focus on is that there's a reason all of these answered questions keep coming up again, like the neo-Kantian, right? That Lenin was criticizing in Materialism and Imperial Criticism. It's because, frankly, the Marxism has gone away, and this is something that I'm constantly repeating. We need to get back to Marxism, right? And Carlos is right. There's the dialectics text from Marx never came. But Lenin, in that I believe it's collected works, what is it, 38 or 48? Yeah. It's 38.
38.
Yeah, which is basically his notes on the science of logic. That Into the Science of Logic, coupled with dialectics of nature, can give you that Marx dialectics text. Those two right there. Of course, there's stuff you need to understand before you get to that, right? You can't just dive into the deep end without knowing how to swim. You'll drown, right? So you get your floaties first, right? You take our Basics of Marxism class. You learn from Stalin's pamphlet and short essays by Lenin that make the sort of declarative, what the statements that declare things, right? About Marxism, about the world, that kind of show you organically, oh wait, these guys don't think the way I've been told to think. What is that? And that can get you going. But it really comes out in organizing work. I've been around, hundreds of leftist organizations and socialist parties and communist parties, all of it, right? And the way we are taught about theory in every organization is wrong. I hate to say that, but it's exactly what Lenin was complaining about. People have sort of reverted to this prior mode. And what they do is tell you that theory is more like the direct tactical considerations of an already resolved idea. So the already resolved idea is, Donald Trump is an evil fascist. So what theory can we use to fight Trump is basically the thing. But that gets what theory is altogether wrong, right? Because the theory, the philosophy behind it, is what teaches you what fascism is, how to correctly analyze Donald Trump, and all of that, right? It's not a sort of recipe to plan protest, which is how it gets treated. And what grinds my gears on it is that in reducing theory to this vulgarized, like genuinely vulgarized, minimal level, there's so many mistakes that just create wild misdirection, class collaborationism, all kinds of bad stuff we don't want, right? Like going to texts like Principles of Communism, right? Which is a very short, plain text, but going to that for your definition. I think by now we can all know, everybody watching this knows that when we're using definitions of things, we need to be mindful of a definition's limitation. But if you don't know all this and you don't understand dialectical thinking, you could go to principles of communism and go, oh, Engels is giving me a definition of the proletariat. Therefore, I apply those words to the real world. But what is that? That's a dogma, right? That's fetishizing almost what Engels had said in a particular time and place, taking it out of that time and place, right? Going, huh, bringing it here, right? Putting it, foisting it onto our time and place. And you can't do that. And understanding the actual philosophy behind it, the Marxism behind it, that is what teaches us why we can't do that.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. As we always try to emphasize, Marxism is not a series of dead, stale conclusions. That's not even how we approach the question of what's true. In a world that's so fluid, that's in a constant process of flux, truth is always dependent on time and space. It's always dependent on context. So, yes, there are some conclusions that are so valid, but the heart of what Marxism is the method. It's the worldview, and that forces it to be something quite unique in the history of philosophical systems, right? Almost since the beginning, philosophy has attempted to think about the world comprehensively, to think in terms of totalities, in terms of wholes. But it usually has produced very rigid and insular totalities and has lent itself to dogmatism. The
Kantian.
interesting thing, the interesting thing about Marxism as a philosophy that's not scared to make these statements, these grand narrative statements that freak the postmodernists and the postmodernized so-called Western Marxists out. It's its openness to continuously changing. The way that it sees itself as a philosophy of totalities that can assess totalities, it's the same way it sees totalities as ever evolving, changing, and it's absurd if it studies these wholes that it recognizes as in a state of constant movement, for it to think of its own philosophy as static and closed. It's open, it's creative, and it's in a constant state of development. And that gets me to, I think, the second point that I think Lenin
Well, let's
developed.
before we get to the second point, we have a couple super chats we should get
Yeah,
to.
I don't want to distract from the Lenin uh,
Okay.
discussion. We can hit those after the
Sure.
Lenin discussion, I think. Some of them are quite funny, like this one. Thank you so much, Ross. Marx had hydradenitis. I think I got that right. So do I. That's where his genius come from. Yeah, yeah. It's
I don't
he
know
was
what
in a lot of
hydradenitis
pain.
is. What is that?
I have no idea. I always thought he had something. I forget the thing that I assumed he has, but he was in constant pain for most of his life. Thank you so much, Ross, the official sugar daddy of the Institute. Marcus, thank you so much again, brother. Someone who's been consistently funding the Institute
Ooh.
every stream with a €6 super chat here. Shout out to the 1 million Germans that protested against the far right AFD last weekend, a great gathering where we Marxists can intervene. Absolutely. Hope to discuss a little bit that a little bit more thoroughly after the Lenin discussion. And Kyle Pettis, the Institute's official labor guy. Thank you so much for the $10, brother.
Thank you, brother.
The rejection of all the wonders of mankind is one of the largest failings of the purity fetish left. Absolutely, they reject culture in almost all forms as backwards and quote unquote problematic. That they have no material analysis. Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct, and it stifles us not just in our ability to have the best analysis, but in our ability to be cultured and full individuals. What's the point of winning socialism if we can't develop culturally? The fetters that capitalist relations of production provide are not just for the forces of production, they're for the forces of cultural production as well. It limits cultural development. And how are we going to consider ourselves communists if we're not going to try to drink In Spanish, you say beber from these wonderful traditions that have, in many cases, been the most advanced and crystallized and coherent thoughts of their time. But thank you so much, everyone, for the super chats. Of course, this is a people's funded, grassroots funded institute. So all of our funding comes from you all. So it's incredibly appreciated. We wouldn't be able to do a fraction of what we do without the funding. So thank you. The second point that I think Lenin develops, the Marxist tradition, is that the critique of political economy is by its own internal necessity, not just because Lenin was a genius, he was, but the critique is taken to this new stage of capitalism, where capitalism has monopolized fully, where there's this transition from competition to monopoly, and where finance capital ends up taking dominance. And you have this constant scourge between the leading imperialist powers for the division of the world, specifically of the global South. And he tells us something that's, it couldn't have been more prophetic. He's telling us this at the late 19 teens, and it's that imperialism, insofar as it exists, is going to mean constant war. Constant war. And what we find out after 1917 is that it's not just inter-imperialist wars to plunder the global South, it's also wars against the few countries that have been able to break out of the stranglehold of imperialism, and that exists, as our tradition labels it, outside of the sphere of influence of the spheres of influence of imperialism. These countries have been subjected to hybrid warfares constantly, forever, whether it's from the Soviet Union, and that's something that Lenin sees very early on after the revolution, how thoroughly and comprehensively they were attacked by the imperialists, blockades, invasions, counter-revolutionary civil wars promoted, and just horrendous things that have been just refined throughout the history of socialist and anti-colonial struggle. So, that was for me the second biggest and extremely pertinent insight that Lenin develops within the Marxist tradition. And we live in a stage where the dominance of finance capital is even more intensified than in Lenin's time, where specifically after the Second World War, the development of these global financial institutions, the dominance of the dollar, which is now fading, crumbling, it becomes clearer and clearer how finance capital calls the shots and how globalized it is. So in many ways, that thing Lenin analyzed and saw the essence of has taken itself to a new level. Whether we call it neo-imperialism, a higher stage of imperial, whatever we want to call it, it's the foundation is given to us, though. The critical foundation is given to us by Lenin.
I've taken to calling it Imperiosaurus Rex. I'm dumb. No, that's absolutely right. I think just as, and here's the thing, we're missing our Lenin, right? Just as society was transitioning into this new stage of monopolization, and this embryonic stage of finance on the top, right? Dominating and just drawing sucking wealth out of society in multiple levels, just, through from the proletariat, through the industrial bourgeoisie, and up into the financial bourgeoisie, right? That's how it goes. But now it's consolidated to such a point that complete globalized commodity production is carried out, right? We have the technology and the centers of capital necessary to have these giant global cartels with investment capital, once again, at the top. Nothing productive about that. No value being added into the economy, simply sitting like a giant leech. Picture like a leech on top of a globe, just sitting on the top, just whoop, 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 getting bigger and bigger and bigger off of our blood, right? That's what a leech does. It drains your life force from you. Our labor, the thing that makes us humanity, is already foreclosed on because we're all in debt. It's already owned by someone else. Most Americans, like the vast majority of us, have either a zero or a less than zero net worth, meaning we own nothing, right? You know that WEF slogan, you will own nothing and you will be happy? We're owning nothing already, only we're pissed off, right? And Lenin sees how pissed off everyone is there at the beginning of this process. And it's up to us to understand where we are at the end.
Sorry to interrupt, but not only do we not own anything, we owe, sometimes to the tunes of debt that accumulates to something that maybe our yearly paycheck doesn't even reach. So,
right. Well, it's and this is the weird thing. Libertarians are constantly like hating, just spending so much time and energy hating a cartoon that does not exist, right? They're like, oh, the communists are gonna take everything I own away from me. Dude, the ruling class already did that. And Marx calls them on it right in the manifesto. Like the very first basic thing, right? He says that that the communists get reproached with wanting to do away with private property. But in the current system, right, private property is already done away with for over 90% of the population. And the people who own property, right, they own it specifically because the way that ownership functions prevents the 90% from owning property. So really what they reproach us with is wanting to do away with a form of property that the necessary precondition for is no property for the vast majority of people. So what they really reproach us for is wanting to do away with their property. And I just got to say, goddamn right we are. Well, that's it.
absolutely. So to go on to the third point, the third important insight. By the way, for those that just came in, our discussion on Lenin and the 100th anniversary of his passing is based on this article that I wrote a couple of days ago on the anniversary of Lenin's passing, called "The five of Lenin's Insights That Are More Pertinent Than Ever." We've already discussed the first two. We're going on the third one now, but the third one is, I think, the development of an analysis that was already in Marx and Engels that took into consideration the anti-colonial national liberation struggles as forms of class struggle. And here's where, again, the philosophy is completely essential. If you understand what a universal is on the basis of the old school Western philosophical tradition, which the universal is literally that which is not the particular. The universal is that which exists. Right. The universal is that which exists the same way, in the same form, regardless of space and time. You know, you're going to be missing out on quite a bit. The way the dialectical worldviews, whether it's in its origins in Heraclitus or with Hegel or with Marxism, the universal is universal because it takes a variety of different particular forms. What makes the universal universal is the intimate dialectical relationship it has with the particular. And when we say that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, we're making a universal proclamation, a universal statement about class society, that it is pervaded by class struggles, and that it is those class struggles which are the engine of the movement of history, the engine that develops one mode of life into another on the basis of those contradictions that the class struggle manifests. Now, the class struggle doesn't look the same all throughout history. It takes a variety of different particular forms. Engels had already observed in Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, the order of which is essential because that's the order out of which they appear in history, that the first class struggle was against patriarchy. Why? Because that's the foundation. The foundation of the monogamous family allows the transfer of private property down, removes the capacity for communal property to stay communal. That develops private property, and private property, once it's accumulated to a certain stage, the people who own it need to defend it from the people who don't, and you have a state, which is the mechanism that allows those with property to defend that property. So he sees the struggle against this form of patriarchy as the first historical particular form, determinate form that the class struggle takes. It's taken many forms. When workers fight against their boss in the factory, that is one of the central forms that it takes under capitalism. What Marx and Engels saw in their time with the case of Poland, with the case of Ireland, was that these national liberation struggles, these struggles against colonialism and imperialism, they were forms of class struggle. It was absurd to speak about the struggle of workers at a factory as class struggles, and then when people are standing up against colonial oppression, say that no, those are not class struggles. The same thing in Marx and Engels' estimations with the American Civil War. It's absurd to say, well, the class struggle is only happening in the North with the workers within the factories. No, the Civil War was a manifestation of class struggle. It was the black proletariat, as Du Bois calls it, fighting back, specifically through the means first of a general strike and then through helping the North as soldiers, spies, etc., removing the productive base of the South, a double hit upon the Confederate economy and war potential that won the war. And then, as we've talked about a million times, established a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat in the U.S. South, led by the Freedmen's Bureau. So these have been different forms that the class struggle has taken. And what Lenin is able to see is that in the stage of imperialism, one of the central forms, one of the principal forms that the class struggle takes is in the form of these national liberation struggles. And it's not very hard to see how, again, prophetic that proclamation was, a proclamation that was rejected by the so-called orthodox, vulgar distorters of Marxism that were rooted in the Second International, that didn't really care about the colonial question. They were focused on narrow class struggles within the imperial core. Many of them even saw imperialism as a progressive force because they had this dogmatic idea that the global South had to become capitalist first before it could then struggle for socialism because it needed to develop a proletariat. No. Lenin's ingenuity sees the potential of the peasant-proletarian alliance in struggling for socialism, and it builds on Marx's analysis that understands that, yes, you need the development of the productive forces, that is fundamental, but you don't need to have it with capitalism. You don't need to just sit around and wait with your hands in your pockets for capitalism to take root, and then maybe in 50 years, 2 generations down the line, after millions of people have been slaughtered, exploited, and have just wasted their life living in misery, then you can decide to start fighting for socialism. Lenin sees the centrality of these national liberation struggles and urges the proletarians within the imperial core, waging the struggle that we're more familiar with from the writings of Marx and Engels, to see the unity of their struggle with those fighting against imperialism and colonialism. And this could not be more pertinent today as the empire continues to feed off of the republic. That is a very important phrase from Michael Parenti. The empire is feeding off of the republic. Our cities are going to shit. Our people are living worse and worse than ever. It's harder and harder for the American people to get through. Not to live comfortably, just to survive is harder. And our government is sending hundreds of billions of dollars to literal Nazis in order to fight its wars against the enemies of empire. What does that mean? That those forces struggling against imperialism, struggling against the today's forms of colonialism and neocolonialism, their struggles are aligned with ours. If they win, we win. If the Palestinians win, we win. If the Russians win against the war, the fascistic war of aggression that is taking root against Russia, that has been ongoing since the overthrow of the Soviet Union, we win. If they lose, we lose. Because this is how the class forces have aligned themselves globally. The anti-imperialist camp has its natural allies in the working class struggle within the imperial core. The position we have to take there is one of revolutionary defeatism. Our imperial rulers, our elite, has to lose for us, the working people, to win. And that insight is refined and developed by Lenin in a stage where imperialism makes it more evident that proletarian revolution is a genuine possibility, conjoined with these revolutionary anti-colonial national liberation struggles in ways in which it wasn't in Marx and Engels' time.
100%. I want to make two quick points just to follow up on everything Carlos is saying. First, that national liberation, a working class in one country struggling against the ruling class of another country, right? Coming to dominate it, keep it subjugated, right? How could you ever see that as anything but a form of the class struggle, right? That's one. Two, if you understand the Marxist view of universals and particulars, well, then the particular form that the advance of the productive forces takes is based on the relation between human action and its being and its social being, right? And once you have this globalized class struggle coming into being on the international level, then you, like Lenin says, why do we have to wait for capitalism? Stagism disproven, basically. We don't have to get into a whole thing. But I also want to hit on the fact that we seem to be in this place in the US where so many people misinterpret Lenin and try to twist him into saying that there is no alignment between proletariat in a developed country and an anti-colonial struggle elsewhere, right? That say only that anti-colonial struggle matters. There is no proletarian struggle in the developed countries, right? And they sort of flip it to, side with other people in other countries they've never met, will never meet, because they sort of romanticize it, whatever. And that's fine, but that's not what Lenin was saying, right? For the whole history of Marxism, this more stagist sort of view where it takes a developed proletariat to begin realizing that they're proletarians to engage in a communist revolution, right? But Lenin throws all that up into the air. It isn't one or the other, ever in Marxism. We can't take a one-sided view to these things. We have to understand the particular and the universal, right? That universal struggle we all share. We need to find the particular form it takes in our era, in our place, right? Nobody in Nicaragua wants us to pretend that we're Nicaraguan and go down there and, say like, yay, Nicaragua. No, they don't want that, right? They will tell you straight up, why aren't you studying Marx? Why aren't you having a revolution where you're from?
Yeah, there's always that story from Michael Hart, someone who co-wrote with Antonio Negri, who recently passed, a book called Empire, which is Trotskyism for our day. Very much rooted in the Western Marxist tradition and in a very futile, semi-theoretical, postmodernized, divorced from the class struggle form of Marxist, quote-unquote Marxist theory. But he goes to Nicaragua and he asks, what can I do? I want to help. And they tell them, go the fuck back home and have a revolution in your country. He's like, wow, I didn't even know how to do that, how to start. And that romanticization of other people's struggles it's not only not beneficial for the struggles in your own country, it's also not beneficial for the struggles in those countries, precisely because their struggles are half and half against their ruling class, the other half against ours, because we live in the belly of the beast. It's also, I think, in many ways, and here, if I may introduce a philosophical concept, ressentiment. It is rooted in ressentiment and resentment. You hate your working people, so you develop this inverted love for the working people and the struggles of other countries, and that's not a genuine love. No genuine love is developed on the basis of hating something else. It's the other way around. I hate the bourgeoisie because I love the people. I don't love the people because I hate the bourgeoisie, right? There's a
Precisely.
fundamental difference there. Um, but yeah, no, go ahead if you have any other points in this area. If not, I can move on to the fourth one.
Well, nothing that we haven't really covered very extensively in the past, but I think that a lot of it is the inability to see things clearly, which means they have a lack of theory, right? So the purity fetish left, or what we can sometimes call the mean word left, right? Will see someone saying mean words, and they're mean words, right? They're not nice, they're not polite, they're antagonistic, they're wrong, whatever. Um, but what they do is blow that out of proportion into a symbol for the entire working class here, or entire X or Y, or this niche or that niche. And what this is for me is what I call the brand marketing economy, right? This person saying the genuinely mean things, the messed up things, whatever they are, right, becomes symbolic of everyone else. So anyone who says something on a different subject similar to that person, say the mean person flies an American flag, right? Therefore, everyone who flies an American flag also thinks this mean thing, right? And it's not a way to do politics. It's not a way to view society clearly. It's a very emotional, reactive way of seeing the world, and it people develop resentments that way. They're ressentiment, right? They develop this fantasy then of people in other countries in the third world where there are all these romantic heroes fighting, the evil Americans who they don't like because the mean word symbol has become everyone in their country for them, right? And the media does not help with this. The media reinforces this and creates it. I don't know.
Yeah, perfectly said. By the way, before we go into the fourth point, Jay here mentions I picked up the new Reagan's book yesterday. Make sure to pick it up. This is a commentary and reflection on Lenin's Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, a text where he's flaming Kautsky's absurd purity fetish critiques following the Bolshevik revolution. And just like Lenin calls Kautsky renegade and explains why, Tom discusses who the renegades are in our movement today. So it's incredibly pertinent.
It's his best book, by far his best book.
It's yeah. I agree with that. And thank you so much, Future Homestead. 45K. We made it to 45K. We have a very very long way to go. We have no pretensions about the fact that if everyone subscribes in America to the Institute, we'll have a revolution the next day. No, we need organizations on the ground, real world organizing. But social media is the most important ideological field of struggle for the war of positions in our day. At one point, as Althusser mentions, it was the church that was the centerpiece of obtaining consent from the masses. He argues that in the 20th century, it switches to the schools. And now I think it's fair to say that it's social media. This is a battle that is extremely important. It's necessary. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. So make sure if you like our content, if you think we provide valuable ideas for the advancement of the class struggle, to share it around. That's all we can ask. If you don't have the capacity to donate and help us financially, at least help us get the word out and break through whatever bourgeois algorithmic suppression is holding people with our ideas down, which of course there's quite a few of those.
We want to hit 100K by 2025. I think we can do it.
Yeah,
So
that
tell
would be pretty
everybody
good.
you can. Get them to subscribe. The thing is, there's a certain level when you're in the double digits where you pass a suppression threshold,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Where you come up in more searches and stuff. So getting into the triple digits is huge. Sign up on all your accounts, you know.
So the fourth point that I think Lenin really develops within the Marxist tradition is the understanding of the state. Of course, his main text here is The State and Revolution. We have a reading guide to that that Eddie did some years ago. We also have a book, Tom's first book, Reading the Classical Text of Marxism. It provides within it a commentary and analysis of the state and revolution. But here, why do I consider it a creative development? Well, in many ways, yes, he is pulling from Marx and Engels' texts, but in doing so, he is systematizing the Marxist idea of the state, which, of course, we have to look at in an analogous form, as we discussed earlier, concerning the class struggle, right? A state is almost like this universal entity for class society that takes different forms. You know, today libertarians are talking about the state, hating the state, all these other things. Communism means stronger state, more state, we need less state, etc., etc. There's no such thing as the state in general. There's different types of state. The feudal state is extremely different from the state we have today. And it's also very different from the slave democracy states of ancient Athens or the early Roman Republic. And it's the early capitalist state. It's extremely different from the, highly dystopian in many ways state that we have today. That's very based in surveillance and all these other different things, and that has a massive military-industrial complex. So this state is a product of the moment that we're in terms of history of how developed the forces of production are. There's no state in general. So Lenin crystallizes these general ideas and understandings of the state, helps us understand what the capitalist state is, and how it is the case that those capitalist states, you can't just grab power and boom, you're in and out, that's it, you have socialism. You have to destroy, you have to abolish the capitalist state. You have to send it to the heaps of history and create in its place a state that is by, for, and of working people. A state that allows working people to have the power to squash the enemies of the popular revolution, both those at home and those abroad that take the form of the imperialist fighting through hybrid warfare and various means to overthrow a people's popular revolution. So he helps us refine the understanding of the state, and specifically the understanding of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the form socialism has to take in its first stages. We need a strong, efficient, developed state that can develop the forces of production, ensure that the living standard of the people is superior to what it was before, ensure that things are being done more efficiently. And this is, again, the Lenin after the revolution that recognizes we need the technicians in order to be better, to develop the forces of production, to do all of these things. Very creative Lenin, open to the NEP, understands that as long as the communists have the supremacy of political capital, we expropriate all of the political capital from the bourgeoisie. But the economic capital is done, as Marx and Engels already stated in the manifesto, it's wrested by degrees. If the bourgeoisie's capital can be used to develop the productive forces, there's China, lifted 800 million people out of poverty, gave itself a central position in the global economy, and is a beacon for the socialist movement today. When it doesn't do that, there you have Stalin's collectivization. What more important communist policy could have been given at a time like that. So be flexible, but the essence has to be strong state to repress the enemies of the people. There's a little bit of Robespierre in there. It's not just Marx and Engels. And an efficient state that can develop the forces of production, the sciences and the technologies, so that we're not shoved into being low-tech producers for empire, a central condition of dependency and neocolonialism, and that can protect the people's revolution and fight against imperialism.
Yeah, and this is something Marx theoretically works out for us, that the proletariat must consider the conquest of political power primary, right? We're not going to just take all of the capital. It don't work like that. We need the power to do so, to create our own and overwhelm them. And that's precisely what China did, right? And this is something libertarians, anarchists, whatever you want to call them, don't really understand, because every time we talk about, well, what we need is a very strong people's state to make sure that we can fight back against capital, right? They're like, but how do you, but how is the state going to wither away if you're building it up and stronger? And what I like to do when that happens is flip it around on them. Why do you think it's not? Right? Like, let's think about this logically. If we are to genuinely build up a new state with new institutions that work for the people, what good is it if it's weak and underfunded and has no power, right? The class enemy is just going to smash us immediately and take it all back, right? Everything that we take back from them, they will destroy or whatever. So you build up a strong state. Now, at the same time, Lenin figures out that it also must be efficient, right? Our state is huge in a way that makes it inefficient. When libertarians say a big state, big government, this is what they're getting at. The original libertarian theory that criticized this in Bakunin and Proudhon was a bureaucracy, right? And the Marxists had a better criticism of bureaucracy, that it's simply inefficient, right? Streamlined departments and institutions without all of the unnecessary barriers to change that our government, for instance, has. Those barriers to change are in place for a reason, because our ruling class does not want things to change. But when the working class is the ruling class, change is necessary all the time. And we need to be able to act dynamically, right? I don't know. That's really it. Yeah, that's it.
I appreciate you bringing it to the libertarian question, because not even just libertarians, people tend to think about the state quantitatively, more or less of a state being good, but it's always qualitatively the bourgeois state that they're thinking about, more or less bourgeois state. But it's still a state whose sole purpose is to reproduce the capitalist mode of production, to reproduce a form of life where a small group of people are just accumulating vast hordes of wealth and keeping everyone else in misery. And they have all of the power in society, power over the educational institutions, over other state institutions, civil institutions, the state itself, the armed bodies of men, etc. And the proletarian state is a qualitatively different type of state. It's a state like no other in history. It's even described by Lenin as a semi-state, because it's the first time in history where it is the majority that the state represents and uses its monopoly on violence, its dictatorial capacities to defend. And it uses those against an previously oppressing minority that is fighting tooth and nail to regain that order that kept them on top, on the backs of so many people living so miserably. So it's a qualitatively different form of state. And Lenin refines that better than literally anyone else in the Marxist tradition. He takes all these disparate comments from Marx and Engels and crystallizes it and gives it his own unique twist, and then develops it with the experience that he had in the first few years of the Bolshevik revolution. But the fifth insight, which I think is essential, and this one might be somewhat controversial, but democratic centralism as, I think, the most effective method of organizing a party and, as the experience of China, Cuba, etc., a state as well. The unity of these seemingly opposing things, whether it's the efficiency of a centralized unity of action or the egalitarian democratic character of that consultation and debate, and democratic discussion that precedes that unity of action. It brings in the best of both worlds, sort of thing, to quote the great legendary American philosopher Hannah Montana. Um, that's what its efficiency. I apologize so much, Noah. That was horrendous. I should be kicked off of the institute just for that joke. Um, it genuinely brings about two polar opposites: democratic elements with centralized and unified
He said
efficiency.
Hannah Montana.
I'm fired. Yes, I'm fired. Oh man, but
Hannah Montana.
but I still think, I know it's hard to say that, right? In a world where, at least in the West, a lot of the communist parties have just gone down the route of, a form of Eurocommunism, tailing the liberals, tailing the social democrats, which are basically just liberals and radical liberals. But I still think that with this crisis in the subjective factor that we have in such an objectively revolutionary, pregnant moment, which is something you can read about if you get the purity fetish, I still think that what is needed today to develop the theoretical capacities of communist militants to organize and to ensure that these spontaneous uprisings of the masses do not just dissipate into like a sort of pressure valve, that they can get used to actually move us forward in the class struggle and hopefully advance in this route of taking power from the bourgeoisie and smashing their state and creating a worker state. What we need is a good vanguard, democratically centralized, organized party. And when it functions correctly, which is the difficult part, I think there's nothing more efficient than democratic debate and then boom, unity of action. The bourgeoisie hears unity of action and it shivers. It's so scared because every single ruling class in history, not just the bourgeoisie, it needs divisions. It needs to divide et impera. It needs to divide in order to rule, in order to conquer. Just go look at James Madison's Federalist 10. It's like we factionalize people, we divide them so that the primary faction in society isn't the one that's surrounding the property question between those who own and those who don't and are forced to work for a miserable living. So democratic centralism, I still think it's an incredible development of Lenin's that is still as pertinent as it ever was.
Yeah, and you hear criticisms of democratic centralism by people who call themselves communists, who are in positions of authority in different organizations, and they go, well, it just doesn't work. We ask people to do things and they don't do them. That's because democratic centralism needs to begin in leadership. It needs to begin in actually sort of formalizing a democratic process on all questions, right? If you're in an organization and they're forcing you to do things that you never voted on, there's been no democratic process there, right? If they're forcing you to, if they're answering big questions that they should be going to the whole party on their own, there's no democratic process there. So they don't deserve that unity of action from the rank and file. Because, and here's the test of a great leader, you don't just order the party around. You don't, you're not a dictator. They're not your plaything to do with what you will. They're individual men and women who are there for a reason, for a cause. Instead, a real leader wins the party to the Marxist position, because not everyone in the party is going to know their Marxism backwards and forwards, right? Hopefully, at least one person in each club does, but we're not there yet. Let's be real. We are not there. We're not even close to there yet. So, the real leader, rather than whining when people don't do what they want, wins the party to the line, gives them an opportunity to have input on the decisions of the party. If the party is going to back a certain policy of a certain union or go help some other institution or another, then that needs to be up to the party. It is unity of action, but only after freedom of debate. You need one for both to function. And our chat
Absolutely.
died. What happened?
Well, that's been what has been missing. You know, a lot of times we haven't been able to enjoy the efficiency of democratic centralism because that first and perhaps most difficult component, the democratic one, has been absent. And as you said very spectacularly, you can't expect unity of action if the democratic component is not there. It's a dialectical interplay such that they're so interdependent and mutually conditioning that if you miss one, you are not going to get the best of the other. The absence of one will signify the absence of the value that the unity of both provides, which is ultimately the reason why one decides to have democratic centralism as the method for their respective organizations. So those were the 5 points that we developed as what is the most pertinent from Lenin's thoughts and developments upon the Marxist tradition for us today. Just to repeat, the philosophy, the theory of imperialism, which you can't understand the world today without Lenin's theory of imperialism, the role of national liberation, anti-colonial struggles, the understanding of the state and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and last but not least, the role of democratic centralism as the method through which we structure party practices and you might even argue the state in many ways. So, but Leninism, Marxism, Leninism is not enough for us today. It is necessary, but not sufficient. We need to have a Leninism that's adjusted to our particular conditions, which in the Institute, we have considered that it means going back to the insights of the father of American Marxism, W.B. Du Bois, his understanding of the color line, the role of the anti-racist struggle as a form of class struggle in the U.S. It means going back to Henry Winston, to understanding the role of Martin Luther King Jr. in changing the Constitution and the horizon of the nation. Even though he wasn't, quote unquote, a communist, he is someone whose thought we must also study very closely, because in many ways it defines the spirit of our nation and the movement of our people. Go ahead, Noah.
Well, what does Lenin teach us about that, right? Don't just learn Marxist.
Exactly.
Learn from all of the, what does he say, the treasures of mankind, or the jewels, or whatever it was.
Yeah. So we need a Leninism, Marxism, Leninism that is adept to the specificity of the class struggles that have occurred in the U.S., which means, of course, bringing forth this analysis, understanding the American trajectory, which is central to the thinking of the Black Freedom Movement, which has been really every figure we have pointed out has been from the Black Freedom Movement. Understanding last century's bourgeoisification of the working class, a process of creating this middle class. Understanding this century's reproletarianization, which has been one of the most important theoretical developments, I think, for understanding the U.S. It has been developed by yours truly there, Noah Kershivik. Understanding how the purity fetish is the positive form that the absence of dialectical materialism takes, and how it's what allows for all these theoretical errors to take a variety of different forms. Understanding basically how it is that things have changed, and how on the basis of a concrete study of the concrete, that means on the basis of the dialectical materialist outlook, as it has been, of course, developed by the Leninist tradition, how do we make sense of the reality that we currently experience as Americans, and how do we not just make sense of it, but understand it in a way that's aimed towards changing it in a revolutionary manner?
Could not have said it better with that than that. I think that's a perfect way to end it for the night, brother. Thank you to everybody who came and discussed a little Lenin with us tonight. Make sure to check us out at patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. We appreciate everybody and every nickel you send. This is a completely people-funded institute. Without that, we can't bring you guys great stuff like this. We can't bring you the classes, none of that stuff. So thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. Been 100 years of Lenin, and here's to the next 100, huh?
Yes. So before we go, I have something else to promote.
I'm so sorry.
Sure. Yeah. Again, patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. Patreon doesn't take any cuts, so it's the most efficient way for all of your dollar to get to us. Make sure to check out our books. Here we have the last one we published from Dr. Riggins on Lenin's Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. We have the third Journal of American Socialist Studies coming out late February. We had to push it back. Our whole attention has been on the Zionist genocide of the Palestinian people. We were hoping to put it out in December, but life throws rocks at you sometimes. We have a bunch of other works in the publishing press that should be coming out within the first half of this 2024. If you want to support my writing as a philosopher, make sure to check out the Philosophy in Crisis Substack. I've been able to build up 800 and something subscribers on there. So if you have a few emails, make sure you can sign up for free. And if you want to subscribe to read all of the articles, including the ones that are behind paywalls, you can do that for the monthly price of a cappuccino, which has been the way that I've been pitching it. Maybe for the monthly price of a tea if you're in Britain, or something else comparable. That's $5. So make sure to check that out. And I wanted to promote an event that we have coming up February 4th. It's on the 25th anniversary of the Bolivarian Revolution. We're co-sponsoring it with the International Manifesto Group, Venezuela Analysis, Orinoco Tribune, and the Critical Theory Workshop. This is the first time we co-sponsor something with Venezuela Analysis, which Eddie will tell you how fundamental they have been for our research and study on Venezuela. As speakers, we'll have Cira Pascual Marquina, Alan Freeman, Saheli Chaudhuri, Jesus Rodriguez Espinosa, Danny Shaw, and your very own Edward Liger Smith. So it should be a very, very special event. We're going to be doing it through Zoom. So if you want to be there in person with your camera on and have a chance to ask a question, you should be able to do that. So look out for that. We'll be promoting how you can sign up to be one of the Zoom attendees of the conference. And yeah, without further ado, thank you so much to those who were able to donate and fund the Institute. Marcus, thank you so much, brother. Thank you so much, Ross. Thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you to all of you who were able to watch and share the stream. And we'll see you in the next few days, probably. So thank you so much, Noah, for joining me as well.
Bye, everybody.
Peace.
of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.